Okay, so in the first video we talked about the aims, intentions, and some of the background to Locke's essay about the epistemic modesty that he thought went hand in hand with his project, and briefly about how he wanted to execute his project within an empiricist framework. And that's what we're going to be talking more about today. And in particular, we're going to be talking about his arguments in chapters 2 through 4 of book 1 against any kind of innate knowledge, innate ideas, or innate principles. And as he affirms at the very end of chapter 4 of book 1, indeed the very end of book 1, he sees this argument against the very possibility of innate knowledge as part of this project of clearing the ground away. So before he wanted to start on his own positive project of saying where our ideas come from, how we get all the different various ideas we have, what we could know, and what the limits of our knowledge are, ultimately what we can know about even these very abstract philosophical objects like God, what a person is, as we'll see next week. Before we get to that positive project of saying what we can know, he first wants to remove from the picture this one possible account of where our knowledge comes from, namely that we could have important sources of knowledge that come not from experience but are somehow born in us, innate. So first, some vocabulary. We're going to call Locke's view here anti-nativism. Why? Well, nativism is the view that there is innate knowledge or ideas. Not that all our knowledge or ideas are innate. No one said that, or no one who we looked at anyway, Descartes, Spinoza, never said that all knowledge is innate. They seem to say that innate knowledge is of a special and important kind, but the main point is that in this terminology, to be a nativist is to hold that at least some probably important kinds of knowledge is innate. What does Locke talk about when he's saying that there's innate knowledge? So, reading from the first section there of chapter 2, Locke says, "It is an established opinion amongst some men that there are in the understanding certain innate principles, some primary notions, koinai and noiai, characters as it were stamped upon the mind of man, which the soul receives in its very first being and brings into the world with it." So we've seen, especially in Descartes, he thinks the idea of God is innate, but what is Locke thinking of here? What are the ideas or principles that are alleged to be innate that Locke is going to try to say are not innate? Well, the first principles are axioms of mathematics, the maxims of mathematics, what Spinoza calls the common notions, where common notion here is the translation of this Greek term koinai and noiai. And so when Locke talks about the primary notions or axioms, and they're all talking about the same thing. These first principles that are used especially in mathematics, although we could extend that outside of mathematics as Spinoza does to talk about these first principles of knowledge. So that's just a general name for these first principles. Well, what kind of principles are there? Well, Locke says, he gives the examples, he repeatedly uses some of these examples. It is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. So the idea is that's not something that we learn through experience, according to people, but it's rather something that is innate. whatever is. The whole is bigger than the part. And then innate ideas allegedly could be the idea of substance, again in this philosophical sense where we distinguish substance from mode, or the very idea of number, or of duration, or of infinity. The thought is, these seem to be ideas that we don't get through any kind of particular experiences, and so some people have thought that they were innate. Now if we move to practical principles, the golden rule, right? To treat others as you would want to be treated. Locke brings this up later, and this is something that people have thought, where do we learn this? Is it learned through experience? Well, people have thought it was innate, and in fact, some people have drawn on scriptural evidence for this in Romans chapter 2, verse 13 to 15, and it talks about certain things being written on the hearts of men, and suggests that some of these principles are not coming from experience or even revelation, but are innate. We see that something like the golden rule is followed in all different cultures, even ones that haven't been exposed to Christian revelation. And then finally, the idea of God is obviously one that people have thought to be innate. Especially we've seen that in Descartes, but that's in other writers as well. So this idea of nativism, right, where nativism means you think that there are some innate ideas, innate knowledge, innate principles. This is roughly equivalent to rationalism. Not metaphysical rationalism necessarily, but epistemological rationalism. This is how we set apart certain thinkers to describe their view. Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, who we didn't get to, they're all epistemological rationalists because they think that not all knowledge comes from experience, some knowledge is innate. And then the anti-nativist is roughly equivalent to empiricism. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume are the examples of that from the early modern period. If you think that there is no knowledge at all coming from innate sources, then you're going to be an empiricist. If it doesn't come innately, then if it wasn't there all along, then you had to have gotten it through experience, and that is the idea of empiricism. Now, Locke certainly does have Descartes in part in mind, and he'll talk about Descartes a bit later, especially when we come to some of the metaphysical questions, but he doesn't necessarily have Descartes in particular in mind when he's giving his arguments against innate ideas. So I'll just give you one example of a source of Locke's thoughts about what innate ideas are. Lord Edward Herbert of Cherbury wrote a book, De Veritate, published in 1624. So this was before Descartes is really on the scene. And this work, influenced by Renaissance Platonism, right, argued for a series of innate ideas and principles. Herbert talks about these ideas in Latin as the notitiae communes that come from God and that God stamps on our soul. And so that notitiae communes, that is the translation of that Greek term that Locke used in the first section of chapter 2, the koine enoi. Means the same thing. And later on, Locke mentions Herbert by name to talk about the 5 innate principles of religion. Right? These are the 5 innate principles that Herbert thinks we can arrive at without any experience, but that are implanted in our very nature by God as our maker, right? So when Locke is arguing against innate ideas, he's arguing, at least in part, against this kind of view. So Herbert says these are the first principle here. There's only one supreme divinity. This divinity is owed worship, and this is a principle that Locke comes back to in Book 4, Section 7, without mentioning Herbert at that point. Virtue together with piety is the highest form of divine worship. Sins are to be repented. Rewards and punishments are given out after this life. Now, I don't want to talk about any of these in any detail. I just bring them up to say this is a list that Locke himself introduces in chapter 3 of book 1, just to give examples of the sorts of principles that people have thought were innate, in order to then argue against the idea that we could come to any of these sorts of principles through any innate means. Now, Locke, in fact, says that we do know all of these principles. So Locke's point is not at all to say that we don't know these things. Locke says we can come to know all of these 5 points, but Locke says not through any sort of innate knowledge. So he's saying we can come to those core beliefs of religion through experience rather than through any kind of innate knowledge. Okay, so now we can turn to Locke's actual argument against innate ideas, or for anti-nativism. To start off with, we should acknowledge that nativism presupposes universal assent, or consent, as Locke sometimes says. So if there are innate ideas, then they will be agreed upon by everyone. All human beings, no matter their background, what country they come from, what kind of books they've read, what language they speak, what religion they practice, if there's really innate ideas, then they should be agreed to universally. And so we can see the kind of argument here that if innate knowledge is possessed by someone, it's going to be possessed by everyone. If it's stamped on our soul by our maker, then everyone is going to have this knowledge. But anyone who possesses knowledge of any kind is going to assent to it. And so the conclusion is that if knowledge is innate, then assent to the knowledge is going to be universal. And so the conclusion to this argument is, and the argument takes the form of a kind of a hypothetical syllogism: if nativism is true, then there's going to be universal assent to the ideas, propositions that are innate. So now we need to remember the way that this works, the way logic works here, that we can say, if this argument goes through, that universal assent is necessary but not sufficient for nativism. In other words, if nativism is going to be true, it has to be the case that there's universal assent. Locke agrees to that, or insists on it even. But we can't turn it around the other way. Just because there's universal assent, at least according to this argument, just because there's universal assent does not imply that the explanation for it is that there is innate ideas at work. So that would be simply a fallacy if all you're going on is this argument, it would be just a fallacy to move from a fact of universal assent to a conclusion of nativism. So Locke doesn't exactly accuse his opponents of falling into that kind of crude fallacy, but he does think that the best evidence for nativism, and he calls it the great argument for innate ideas, the best evidence is this universal assent. So again, we shouldn't think that that means that Locke, is accusing his opponents of a crude fallacy, but rather his opponents seem to, the way he characterizes his opponents is as thinking of this as sort of the best explanation. Why does everyone agree throughout the whole world on some of these simple, basic propositions in mathematics or regarding God or something else? The best explanation would be that they are learned not through experience, but rather that they are innate in everyone. So again, Locke's starting point here is this view that the best evidence for nativism would be a universal assent. But the basic structure of his argument is to point out two things. One, universal assent doesn't prove innateness. There could be another reason that accounts for the universal assent. And if that weren't enough, there also is no universal assent. Moreover, we can offer an alternative empiricist account of how we acquire these supposedly innate ideas. And so these 2 points, 1 and 2 here, have to be thought of together, right? He first wants to offer this argument in 1 against nativism, but I think that not all of the weight of his perspective lies just on those arguments that he gives in chapters 2 through 4 of book 1. He also is in the rest of the book, really, or in books 2 and 3, going to give his positive account of where we get all these ideas that are supposedly only innate. So his complete argument against nativism really encompasses not just his particular attack on the very idea of the innate ideas, but rather his argument that we have this empiricist alternative. But I do want to look then at his argument against nativism in the rest of this video. Okay, so his first point is just to say, look, there is no universal assent. He thinks there is no idea and no principle, no bit of knowledge that is in fact universally assented to. And he uses this idea, which we might find somewhat offensive from our point of view to talk about idiots, but his point is simply that there are people with diminished capacities, they're still human beings, and small children, they're not assenting to some of these abstract principles. Think of those 5 principles of religion that Herbert mentioned. Children don't assent to those. If you asked a child, is virtue together with piety the highest form of divine worship, they maybe wouldn't even know exactly what you were talking about, let alone assent to it. And Locke will say something more about the particular case of God and religion later, but here he's focusing on these principles like whatever is. He's saying, you ask a child who knows the words, knows the word whatever, ask him, do you assent to this? Locke is saying the child is not going to know what to say. And Locke thinks, well, if nativism is true, then there ought to be universal assent. A child is a human being. If they don't assent to it, it means they don't have the idea. So the rejoinder that the nativist is going to make, maybe it's obvious, the rejoinder is that some people don't have the capacity to recognize or become aware of their own innate ideas. So in other words, the nativist is going to respond by saying, I'm not saying that children or anyone at all is thinking of these ideas at any given moment, especially these kind of innate principles of religion that Herbert talked about. I'm not saying that small children, as soon as they talk, know these, but I Herbert say, am saying that those ideas are present, hidden somehow in the mind, and the way we get to them is not through any kind of experiences outside, but through a kind of process of uncovering them in ourselves. And so the nativist says that we're not saying that anyone is going to assent to these right away, but rather that some people don't yet have the capacity to recognize them. So they're there, but not recognized. And Locke's first reply to this is to say that this basically is a contradiction, or he hedges a little bit. He says it's a near contradiction to say that there are truths imprinted on the soul which the soul perceives or understands not. So it's a contradiction to have some kind of knowledge or truth in one, but you don't know it, and you don't even maybe understand what it is. Moreover, if we can discover, or else forever be ignorant of these innate ideas, then what distinguishes innate from acquired ideas? So Locke's second point here is, well, if there's some kind of process of discovery and learning involved here, that seems to be the position that Locke is putting his opponent into. There has to be some sort of discovery process. And in fact, as Locke points out, the proponent of innate ideas is committed to saying there could be all these innate ideas we have that are there through our whole lives, and we die, but we never learn them. So if there has to be some kind of process of discovery, then what's the difference? What's the meaningful difference between innate ideas and acquired ideas? So Locke's point, or one way to think about Locke's point, is to say, well, once we bring up this thought that these innate ideas are hidden and have to be learned, then the whole distinction between innate and acquired ideas seems to fall apart. If Locke is right, it turns out that these supposedly innate ideas have to be acquired in some way, and that the proponents of innate ideas have to admit that even this supposedly innate idea has to somehow be acquired or moved from being in me but hidden to being known. So Locke realizes that his opponent, the nativist, is not going to give up so easily. He's going to say, well, there's a difference between discovering by reason and discovering through experience. Say, if I learn things through the senses, through vision, then it's acquired. It comes into my mind through the senses. But this process of learning through reason is a way for me to uncover some truths that are in my mind all the time and just have to be uncovered. So Locke, of course, is not impressed by this reply. He responds essentially by saying that this doesn't change the basic picture. You've just added this word reason and said that, well, there's this process of discovery through reason rather than through some other means. So, to go back to his arguments from before, the idea is that reason undercovers truths inside of oneself, as Locke says in section 9, to make reason discover those truths thus imprinted is to say that the use of reason discovers to a man or teaches him what he knew before. And so that's the same kind of contradiction or near contradiction that Locke already pointed out. The contradiction of saying you have this innate idea, and so you sort of have this innate knowledge without knowing it. Just to say that, well, reason discovers it or reason uncovers it, doesn't avoid that charge. And as he also says a little bit earlier up in that same section 9 of chapter 2, this is page 17 of our text, he says, we may as well think the use of reason necessary to make our eyes discover visible objects, as that there should be need of reason, or the exercise thereof, to make the understanding see what is originally engraven on it, and cannot be in the understanding before it be perceived by it. In other words, you can always just use the word reason and say you need reason to discover something. That could apply to anything, even to vision. And Locke adds that, in fact, the appeal to reason here seems to be out of place, because the idea of reason, as is commonly accepted among philosophers and so forth, is that reason is, as Locke says here in section 9, toward the beginning of the section, reason is nothing else but the faculty of deducing unknown truths from principles or propositions that are already known, right? So reason is the power we have of, drawing inferences, as we talked about earlier this semester, moving from premises to conclusions. That's what reasoning is. But this doesn't tell us how we get to know the first principles. And it's really most of all the first principles that we would be tempted to think are innate, rather than the conclusions that we draw through inferences of reason. Now, of course, someone like Descartes or Spinoza is going to resist this and say, well, the first principles of knowledge are known through intuition or something other than a process of reasoning. This seems clear enough, especially we dwelled on this when it came to Descartes and his knowledge of his own existence. Nevertheless, Locke thinks that this whole strategy of saying that we have some kind of power of uncovering what's already known in us is not going to work. And he sets up a kind of dilemma for this rationalism here, right? Dilemma for the view that we have these ideas that are maybe not present to consciousness all the time, but are innate and can be brought to consciousness through some power of reason or something of that nature. Locke sets up this dilemma. Either everything can be innate in this way, so this would kind of prove too much. That's this idea that, that even things that we would normally say we experience or we know through sight, as he uses in that example in section 9, we could say are innate if we say that we somehow need reason to discover it. If we don't want to go that route and say everything is innate, then we fall to the other horn of the dilemma. Reason is a faculty or a power we have to uncover what we somehow already know. And so there, Locke's going to go back to his claim that this is a contradiction, to say that this knowledge is innate, we know it, but we don't know it. And Locke goes on to say, moreover, that these first principles, they're discovered not by any process of reasoning. Well, we see him, Descartes probably agrees with that point, but Locke says through an immediate assent. So that's really what we should be looking for. That's going to pick out what's distinctive about these first principles compared to other kinds of knowledge, that people immediately assent to them rather than coming to them as a conclusion from a string of reasoning. But as Locke points out, not everyone, even people with reason, rational people who've come to that age of having reason, is going to assent to all of these abstract, as he says, general truths. Think of these abstract truths like whatever is, to say nothing of those 5 innate principles of religion. So not everyone, even forget about children, not even adults with reason are going to assent to all of these. Instead, these are going to be discovered gradually, if at all, but they come only through certain experiences, or if not so much particular experiences, they come through a maturation process. Only someone who's read a lot and thought a lot about these things would even be in a position to agree maybe to the some of these supposedly innate principles, even if, as Locke doesn't deny, these principles are true. Moreover, someone immediately assents to some proposition doesn't at all prove that it's innate. And here Locke relies on bringing up counterexamples, and he has many of these, but to pick out one, he says, yellowness is not sweetness. That might be a proposition you've never thought of, but as soon as someone proposes it, you immediately assent to it. That doesn't at all prove that it's innate, and of course Locke knows no one would claim it's innate. The point is that it's a counterexample to this idea that immediate assent might prove that something is innate. So Locke concludes that, as he says, universal and ready assent, that is, the fact that everyone is willing to assent to some proposition as soon as it's proposed to them, is a mark not of innateness but self-evidence, right? It's yellowness is not sweetness is self-evidently true, but no one would be tempted to say it's innate. It's rather, once those two ideas of yellowness or sweetness are proposed to you, you can immediately recognize that they are not the same thing. And Locke gives what I think is a useful example of this a few sections later in section 23. He says, "For though a child quickly assents to this proposition that an apple is not fire, when by familiar acquaintance he has got these ideas of those two different things distinctly imprinted on the mind, and has learnt that the names apple and fire stand for them, yet it will be some years after, perhaps, before the same child will assent to this proposition that it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be." So one might be tempted to think that that last principle, impossible to be and not to be, is somehow innate, because it's not clear how that principle is derived from any experiences, whereas it's more clear in the case of the apple and the fire that those are not the same things. But I think Locke is trying to call attention to the fact that those two propositions mentioned in this passage have a similar form, and the child is going to assent to the obviously empirical one at a much younger age than the more abstract and general one. That one requires more experience of the world and language before the child is ready to assent to it. And so it would be pretty odd to say that the proposition that one can only come to after many years is the innate one. Okay, so the one other special topic I just want to mention briefly is where the idea of God in particular fits into this picture. Now, if Locke is an anti-nativist, obviously he's going to say the idea of God is not innate, and Locke argues in particular that the idea of God is not universal. That is, there is no universal assent to this idea. And so Locke denies that there is what is called in this tradition a consensus gentium, or an agreement or a consensus of peoples or nations. And this was a typical argument that was given in the context of thinking about the idea of God and the innateness of that idea and the truth of the proposition that God exists, that there was a agreement of all peoples among this. It doesn't matter what experience particular peoples had. It seemed like everyone agreed that God exists. And this actually links back to the point I made about the title page of the essay, the quote from Cicero, because in that text by Cicero, this is a theme, this question of the whether there's a consensus gentium, whether it really is the case that all nations agree on the existence of God or gods, in the case of the things that Cicero is talking about. And in fact, the Epicurean character in that text of Cicero says that there is this consensus gentium, and that this is a reason for thinking that the gods exist, even if they're not providential. And this is a point where the academic skeptic attacks. And for Locke's part, he brings in some empirical evidence for this. He quotes a traveler to Brazil, giving evidence against the consensus gentium. He says, this traveler says, and Locke quotes him, I have found that, so he's talking about a particular group of Native Americans in what's now Brazil. This traveler says, I have found that nation has no word signifying God in the human soul, hold nothing sacred, and have no idols. So this is, and he gives other examples of this against this idea that there's an agreement among all nations. And then the other side of that coin that Locke brings up is that, as he's mentioned before in chapter 2, in the general way, even if there were a consensus, that wouldn't prove anything. There's a consensus that the sun exists, or every people has an idea of the sun. That doesn't prove that the idea of the sun is innate. Okay, so much by the way of the argument against the innate idea of God. We have to remember that when Locke argues against the innate idea of God, he's not arguing that we should be atheists, or that we don't have an idea of God, or that we're not justified in believing in God's existence. Maybe that's hopefully clear already from the other things I've said. Locke thinks we have this empirical evidence for the existence of God. In section 9 of chapter 4 of book 1, he talks about the visible marks of extraordinary wisdom and power that are visible in nature. And so he says basically everyone who's reasonable will conclude from these marks of the Creator in creation that there's a wise God that exists. He says, wise men of all nations came to have true conceptions of the unity and infinity of the deity. So here we see him acknowledging a kind of universality here, but you can see he restricts it to the wise men. And he seems to have in mind reports coming in from what the sages of China and Japan are saying. Sometimes they were considered atheistic philosophies coming from Asia, but here he's saying that wise men of all nations have this conception of God as something infinite, that is unitary, and in particular, what this rules out, what the conception of the wise men rules out, are these kind of anthropomorphic conceptions that Spinoza talked about, and in particular, that the simple conception that the pagans had of Zeus and Apollo and these people who are, like human-like figures. Locke is saying, the wise men of ancient Greece also thought of God not as like powerful human beings, but as infinite beings. So there's this kind of universality in the sense that the wise men come to this, but there's a lack of universality because even people in England don't necessarily have this conception of God. And so this is further proof against the idea that the true conception of God is innate. Locke says, talk but with country people or young people, and you shall find that though the name of God be frequently in their mouths, yet the notions they apply this name to are so odd, low, and pitiful that no one can imagine they were taught by a rational man, much less that they were characters written by the finger of God himself. So Locke is saying, I don't see at all this concept of God that Descartes, for example, talked about, who is simple, infinite, not anthropomorphic at all. I don't see this idea in the ordinary country folk, as he says here. When you hear those people talk about God, you can't see that the true God, who has those characteristics that Descartes correctly talked about, you don't see that God has left his mark on the conception that these people have. And the final point I want to mention about this idea of innate ideas is that for Locke, arguing against these people who suggest there are these innate ideas is not simply an academic exercise or trying to prove empiricism is better out of curiosity or something like that. He does see this view called nativism, we've called it, as closely aligned with dogmatism, and in particular with a lack of freedom of thinking about these kinds of questions, and in particular questions about religion. So Locke says, first of all, that it's kind of just laziness to attribute the origin of some idea to being innate. It's going to be a lot of work to try to show how it is that we could get the idea of God or some of these religious principles, or the idea of unity or duration or infinity. Where do those ideas come from? Locke is saying it's just kind of a shortcut to just say, well, I guess they just are innate. So maybe somewhat ironically, this form of argument here that Locke's concluding with is kind of similar to what Spinoza was saying about ignorance. We say that we have free will just because we're ignorant of what the actual causes are that are moving us to action. When we can't see it, we just call it free will. When we don't understand how nature works, we just call it the will of God. In a way, Locke's saying something different here from a totally different perspective, though, by saying something like that happens with the case of what we call innate knowledge. Since we don't know where it comes from or how we get it, we call it innate. And there's a connection between this ignorance that leads us to call some principle innate and the dogmatism. So Locke says that this nativist view asks us to trust without any farther examination. So to bring up the text here from on page 75 from our reading, section 24 of chapter 4, book 1, Locke says, when men have found that some general propositions that could not be doubted of as soon as understood, it was, I know, a short and easy way to conclude them innate. This being once received, it eased the lazy from the pains of search, and stopped the inquiry of the doubtful concerning all that was once styled innate. And here's where the dogmatism comes in. And it was of no small advantage to those who affected or pretended to be masters and teachers to make this the principle of principles, that principles must not be questioned. For having once established this tenet, that there are innate principles, it put their followers upon a necessity of receiving some doctrines as such, which was to take them off from the use of their own reason and judgment, and put them on believing and taking them upon trust without farther examination, in which posture of blind credulity they might be more easily governed by and made useful to some sort of men who had the skill and office to principle and guide them. Nor is it a small power it gives one man over another to have the authority to be the dictator of principles and teacher of unquestionable truths, and to make a man swallow that for an innate principle which may serve to his purpose who teacheth them. So here, again, there's a parallel with Spinoza, where when there's a form of ignorance and there's this shortcut, supposedly through innate knowledge, this is used, Locke says, by the unscrupulous teachers to control people. The claim, you have these innate ideas in you. It's not a matter of debate, it's just a matter of it being innate in you. There's no other possible idea of God than the one I'm claiming, for example. There's no other possible truths. If you don't see them, it's because you have them covered over in the wrong way because of your own corruption, right? And so Locke is saying this doctrine of innate ideas is not some kind of harmless error. It's actually used by people to control others and to limit them from thinking for themselves. And so Locke sees the essays as providing a way to overcome this kind of dogmatism, look at what our understanding is actually capable of, and then not maybe going all the way to all the metaphysical truths and implications in the text, but at least providing the tools and the background needed for individuals to come to those truths on their own. Nevertheless, as we've seen, Locke does have his own ideas about these things. Those religious tenets that Herbert said were innate, Locke says he agrees with, but he disagrees with the means to get them. He thinks we can get to them through experience. Nevertheless, we can see how these questions about innate ideas are tied together with the questions about the modesty of our knowledge, the limits to what we could know, and how that's tied with questions about religious tolerance and carving out the sphere for belief that is distinct from both what we know for sure through reasoning on the one hand and what is to be rejected as superstitious. Okay, so what is the alternative, and how is Locke going to build up this alternative view of knowledge, its source, its limits, how we can know things about God and these kinds of issues? You may have heard the term tabula rasa, Latin term, the blank slate, from Locke. And this term is one that Locke uses not in this essay itself. In the essay, he uses a couple different metaphors to indicate what the alternative is to the doctrine of innate ideas. Locke says in Book 2, Chapter 15, he gives this metaphor: the senses at first let in particular ideas and furnish the yet empty cabinet. So here I think cabinet is this antiquated word that just means room. So the metaphor is that the mind is brought into the world not with ideas in them already innately, but it's empty, like an empty room that needs to be furnished with ideas. And the other metaphor he uses here, more similar to that of the blank slate, is the white paper. Let us suppose, he says, the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. So he used that image of characters in the first section of chapter 1, where he talked about innate ideas as these characters imprinted on the mind. Here he's like letters of the alphabet. So the idea is that the alternative to the innate ideas is that there is a blank slate or a white paper before any letters have been written on it, or an empty room that we need to give some account of how that room is filled with furniture that would account for all of our knowledge and show what the limits to our knowledge are. So the question then is, how could ideas be added to this white paper or furnish the empty room? Well, as we'll start to see next time, we'll see that Locke is going to say there are two basic sources of the ideas that furnish the mind. There's the external source of sensation, right? The five senses. We get ideas that way. And then the mind can also reflect on its own operations. Locke calls this reflection. And so Locke's principle here, going forward, is that he does not have any idea in his mind but what one of these two, namely sensation and reflection, have imprinted. So one only first has ideas when one begins to perceive. And so for next time, we will talk about Locke's account of what all these ideas are, how we get them, and how from this account we can actually give an explanation of where ideas and principles come from that some of these other philosophers thought were innate. But in doing that, we'll see that there are consequences to taking this empiricist approach rather than the rationalist approach. I think we all agree or accept this idea that, well, this empiricist approach, other things being equal, seems like the way to go. Why would you appeal to innate ideas if you don't have to? So the empiricist approach seems more attractive to us. But we'll see that there might be some consequences to taking that empiricist approach that are counterintuitive or that are not attractive, and so we have to look at that side of it too. If you're going to be an empiricist, what kind of account are you going to have of our knowledge of the external world, of our knowledge of what a substance is, of what unity is and duration and so forth? Can you give an account of all of these things that is satisfactory? So that's what we're going to then turn to next time.